Previously, on Catastrophic Failure, a shocking turn of events.
I am not going to abide by the
New York State Supreme Court Justice Peter Lynch reverses limo company operator Nauman Hussain's no-jail plea deal.
I mean, it sucked the air out of the room because we couldn't believe it. I mean, we all inhaled.
Hussain would stand trial in the deaths of 20 people in the Schoharie limo crash.
All of a sudden it was back on live and going forward, and there just seemed to be a lot to cover. It was exhilarating in a lot of ways.
The families of the limo crash victims finally had a shot at getting the answers and the justice that they were desperately seeking. Going on 5 years after a 2001 Ford Excursion limousine with brake failure crashed into a shallow gully in rural Schoharie County, killing 20 of their loved ones.
And finally, somebody has done the right thing.
Right.
I'm Jessica Marshall. This is Catastrophic Failure, Episode 9, Scapegoat. If you've been with us thus far, you know that the narrative and the details may be upsetting or disturbing at times, so please listen with care. Andrea Austin grew up in Southern California. She loves live theater and volunteers every year at San Diego Comic-Con. She had never heard of a place called Schoharie, New York, until a few years ago. She started dating someone who lived there and decided to make a cross-country move to be with them.
I moved right before the pandemic, like October 2019 I got here, and then by March, April 2020, the whole world was shutting down.
Once she settled in, Austin says her first priority was registering to vote in Schoharie County. And then she enrolled in a nursing program. She was working at a local hospital when she got a jury summons.
My exposure to the case was initially just, I think the Google algorithm popped a news story up. And I read it, probably because I'd been looking up the area since I had never heard of it.
Austin says she did not know much more about the limo crash other than that 20 people had died. But she had an inkling of what she was being summoned for on May 1st, 2023.
I had a feeling that my jury selection envelope, it was probably going to be the case. And then when I walked into the courtroom with everybody and I saw the whole setup, the judge, the defendant, the attorneys and everything, and I went, 99 out of 100, I'm pretty sure that this is that case.
That same morning, I drove out to the Schoharie County Courthouse. Recorder in hand, I walked up to the entrance where dozens of potential jurors had formed a line out the door. I could see many of them clutching identical envelopes containing what I can only assume was their summons. Yeah, and so, I mean, at that point, we had tossed around the idea of doing a podcast on this, not knowing what the verdict was going to be or how the trial was going to play out. But we knew, I should probably tag along with you.
And there were just so many people. It seemed like everyone in Schoharie was there.
The population of Schoharie County is around 30,000. 1,500 of them were sent summons. That's 5% of the county's residents. 90 of those summoned were called to show up on that first day. Because of that large volume of jurors called, Larry and I were not allowed in the courtroom. None of the media were, and neither were any spectators, including Nauman Hussain's brother and his fiancée. We all had to sit together in a room in the basement of the courthouse and watch a live video feed. Jury selection was painfully slow. At this point in the trial, the list of potential witnesses that were slated to testify for the prosecution was in the hundreds.
Judge Lynch had to read every single name to every single juror. Everybody, there were some witnesses everyone knew. A lot of times that would disqualify someone, or especially if they just knew a police officer, boom, they're off.
But one of the challenges I think we were all thinking about going into it was the fact that because Schoharie is so small, it would be really hard to find a jury, like an impartial jury, because maybe some of the folks that came in knew some of the first responders, or maybe the folks were the first responders. But Andrea Austin did not know any of the witnesses, and she didn't have any conflicts of interest not knowing many people in the county. She says when it was her turn to be questioned in the jury box, she was thinking about the defendant, Nauman Hussain.
It's written into our Constitution that we have the right to a trial by a jury of our peers. And I even said that in my answer to, one of my answers to Judge Lynch was, he has the right to a fair trial. He has the right to a fair hearing. It is my responsibility, if I'm chosen for the jury, to give him that fair hearing. You owe that to this person. God forbid, if it were me in a position like that, where I had a high-profile trial going on, I would want the jury to approach it in the same way.
It took a whole week to seat a 12-person jury with 4 alternates. 9 of them were women, 3 of them were men, all of them were white. Andrea Austin was among them. Once the jury was seated, the media and spectators were finally allowed into the courtroom. Larry was there. I was not. Judge Peter Lynch was only allowing the media to record opening statements, closing statements, and the verdict, and I didn't want to take up a seat in the courtroom if I couldn't really record anything. But Larry is a meticulous reporter, and he kept me updated throughout the proceeding.
It was a crowded, very old courtroom, feels very historic and cinematic type of atmosphere. But yeah, it wasn't a very comfortable place to be in, very cramped, and a lot of days there'd be so much media there. It was tough to get a seat.
What was Nauman like? How did he look?
Nauman had the same expression the whole time. He just had his head down. Rarely turned around to see his brother and girlfriend, who now were sitting right behind him.
His dad was not there, right?
His dad was not there.
Yeah.
Never came back to New York or the U.S.
Nauman Hussain remained free on bail, so he could go home every night after court adjourned. He wore a suit in the courtroom, and he now had a close-cropped beard. He looked less like the baby-faced, ball-cap-wearing kid who was arrested nearly 5 years earlier. He was now 33.
Nauman's very quiet, so polite, though, to even all the bailiffs and everything. So it just seemed like a quiet, polite kid, from what I could tell. He did look like he understood what was going on.
The gravity of the situation.
But he never laughed or joked or anything. He was just somber the whole time. Looked like he'd lost a lot of weight.
The prosecution delivered an opening statement first. But it wasn't Schoharie County District Attorney Susan Mallory doing it. Mallory had finally hired help. Prominent criminal defense attorney Frederick Wrench from nearby Saratoga County. Wrench had actually retired about 5 months earlier, but he agreed to step in. He delivered the prosecution's opening statement and handled most of the witness questioning.
The evidence will show that Mr. Hussain's choices led directly to and caused the deaths of those 20 people on October 6, 2018.
Prosecution said, we are going to lay out the facts here, and they're going to be boring, but they're going to prove beyond any doubt that Nauman Hussain never got the proper registrations. He lied on his DMV forms. He broke the law. His car was ordered off the road twice, and he ignored that. Nauman Hussain is the only person in the world who's responsible for those 20 deaths.
Next up, defense attorney Lee Kindlon. Kindlon was the only one of Nauman Hussain's defense attorneys who showed up to court. His co-counsel, Joe Tacopina, was tied up with another case. You may be familiar with it. He was defending former President Donald Trump in a civil trial in Manhattan. Trump had been accused of sexually abusing and defaming magazine writer E. Jean Carroll. A jury ultimately found him liable and awarded her $5 million in damages at roughly the same time that witness testimony got underway in Schoharie.
Judge Lynch had said that they were expected to be there, so it was always kind of curious why they never did show up.
Nonetheless, Lee Kindlon pressed on alone with his opening argument.
There's no question that a terrible tragedy took place on October 6th, 2018. Dozens of lives were irreparably harmed on that day, and the families who are impacted will continue to suffer long after this trial is over. And when something so horrific happens, our natural instinct is to look for someone to blame, just to feel that if someone is held to account, that justice will be done, or that there will be closure for the families that lost loved ones. But finding a scapegoat, condemning the least powerful person involved in declaring victory is not justice. Ignoring those who are most blameworthy, those people and those agencies, that's not justice. Pretending that a single individual caused the death of so many is not justice.
Lee's opening statement was basically, hey, what happened here is horrible. My client grieves all these lives, but it's not his fault. It's the fault of the state Department of Transportation and their workers who we should fire, and Mavis Discount Tire, who charged him for brake work that never was done and gave him a fake inspection sticker. So you decide if my client deserves to go to jail for up to 15 years, or if there's others culpable here.
Reasonable doubt, right?
Yep.
One of the biggest questions circulating around the trial was whether the judge was going to allow the prosecution to show photos of the victims after the crash. As we discussed earlier in this podcast, we chose not to describe the precise details of what happened to the victims when the limo crashed into an embankment at speeds of upwards of 80 miles per hour. We read autopsy reports, but we never saw photos. And it turns out we would not have to see them at trial.
I think Judge Lynch had decided early on in the process, after he threw out the plea deal, that he was going to go out of his way to make sure that the jury wasn't prejudiced with horrible imagery. And I think he also wanted to save the families. I was really nervous going into this trial because Lee Kindlon, who's, a U.S. Marine and has been...
Yeah, he was stationed in Fallujah, right? So he's seen some stuff.
He's seen it all. He said when he had to look through the photos as part of discovery, he said they're the worst things he's ever seen, and that he's a changed man because of them, and not in a good way.
Juror Andrea Nelson said the jury had access to the autopsy reports during deliberation, but they never saw photos either. And she's grateful for that, looking back on it when we spoke to her 6 months after the trial concluded.
I don't think showing graphic photos of any of the victims of the crash, anything like that, would have done any good except to just upset people. It also maybe been very disrespectful to the victims, because what is it they say? They should be remembered as they lived, not how they died.
Once the opening arguments began, the families of the limo victims started coming to court.
Most of them sat in a group together, and they had these state police case coordinators that were there. They were often there to help them with questions about the trial.
I was at the trial every day but one, and I got to understand what they needed to prove.
It was a hard case. It was, even my lawyer said, this is the toughest case that anybody would ever want to try.
Not all of us, but some of us thought this is a slam dunk case.
Mm-hmm.
Any normal jury, other than like a Casey Anthony jury, because I said, they're out there. I mean, this could just go south. And I said, be prepared for him to walk away, because it could happen, but I doubt it.
Yeah.
We'll be right back.
Why is healthcare so expensive? What's happening with climate change? And are elections safe? You can find answers to those questions and a lot more with Capitol Confidential from me, Dan Clark. I give you the latest news and analysis from the state capitol and beyond. Sign up now at capitolconfidential.com. That's Capital with an O, confidential.com.
You're listening to Catastrophic Failure. The prosecution ultimately brought 24 witnesses, a far cry from the hundreds they initially predicted. One of the first witnesses was the other driver that Nauman Hussain had hired to drive for his limo company. His name is James Pachter. We talked about him in an earlier episode. He told Larry that he did not want to drive the 2001 Ford Excursion stretch limousine because it had bad brakes.
This is one of the stronger witnesses because he said, listen, everyone knew that limo had problems with the brakes, and it was so bad that, a professional driver refused to drive it. It's like a huge red flag.
Yeah, and he also talked briefly about the driver certifications and how, at every other company he'd driven for, all of the driver certifications and all the checks and balances that are, required by the DOT were completed. But when he worked for the Hussain's limo business, he was not, asked about any of that stuff. And none of the typical driver procedures were enforced, like checking the vehicle before, you take it out kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Drivers of these stretch limousines basically have to go through the same rigorous amount of medical testing and drug testing that a school bus driver would go through. Someone, protecting dozens of kids every morning on their way back to and from school. And, you can't just be some Uber driver off the street and start driving stretch limousines. Yeah, so he explained that the Hussains didn't require any of that.
Not long after Pachter testified, the prosecution called another familiar name to the stand, Larry Massera. He bought the 2001 Ford Excursion limo new and had it stretched in Missouri. Sort of the most interesting kernel, I think, in all of that was the fact that the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard label was missing when he got the vehicle, right? He had gone out to the Ozarks and picked it up and drove it back to New York, but it was missing that sticker.
There sort of doesn't seem to be any, chain of custody in terms of if that sticker was ever on there. and if Larry had ever put it on or what. But so it's very kind of mysterious whatever happened to that sticker, and no one ever saw it. Basically, it's probably like the most important thing you could have on that car when you left. Otherwise, it wasn't allowed on the road.
And that raises questions too, because before the Hussains had it, the limo had passed the DOT inspection, the new rigorous bus inspection, a couple of times before the Hussains even had it, and it never had that sticker. When it came time for Lee Kindlin to cross-examine Larry Massera, though, things took a turn. The first in a series of dramatic moments during this trial. He approached the judge and he was like, wait a minute, Larry Massera is a convicted felon. We should never have, heard his testimony. And the DA was like, we didn't know he was a felon.
It seemed like Susan Mallory was not prepared and hadn't done her homework. And everyone, I mean, I knew it, that Larry Massera had pled guilty to, a federal offense related to like his railroad pension. He'd worked for the railroad for a while. And it was big news. The U.S. Attorney's Office had put out like a press release. I mean, I knew about it. I'd written about it before the trial.
Lee Kindlin was also well acquainted with this fact. But like any good defense attorney, he was using every tactic available to him to try to discredit the prosecution. He claimed that the prosecution had never shared Massera's federal conviction, something entirely unrelated to his limousine company or the limo, but nonetheless an important detail that was critical to his credibility as a witness at trial. Mallory's defense was that it didn't come up in their background check on him, so they didn't have the information to share in the first place. I Googled Larry Massera's name. His conviction is literally the first thing that comes up. It's really hard to miss. Judge Lynch was not amused. He threw out Massera's entire testimony. The jury had to disregard it.
It just looked bad for Susan Mallory because, this kind of thing was happening where the judge would get mad at her on a regular basis for not having all her ducks in a row.
Day 2 of the witness testimony opened with another moment of drama. One juror did not show up to trial, and the judge threw a second juror out, apparently for smoking marijuana. There were only 4 alternates on the jury to start, and now they were down to 2.
They didn't want to get into a position where they ran out of jurors. They were worried a lot of jurors might try to quit due to the gruesome and emotional nature of the case, and them everyone knowing each other in Schoharie County. And there was this fear that things, if they started losing jurors this quickly, it might imperil the case and they'd have to retry it or something. So just being worried that, are we going to run out of jurors if it keeps up at this pace?
With that reality hovering, the trial continued. Next up on the stand was Chad Smith. He was the New York State Department of Transportation investigator who had been tailing the limo for more than a year before the crash, and who'd put it out of service twice. We talked a lot about what happened with him in episode 4. Larry had already reported on it years earlier. There was nothing new to that story that came out in the prosecution's direct examination. But when Lee Kindlin got up for cross, we got a little more insight into some of the previously unanswered questions about those limo inspections. Lee Kindlin absolutely ripped into this guy, right? The defense attorney absolutely ripped into Chad Smith.
Lee wanted to open up the possibility that sort of Chad Smith didn't do enough to stop Nauman from himself, sort of, so to speak, and didn't do enough to like investigate what was going on with the limo when Nauman would bring it to Mavis for servicing. And so Lee was sort of asking him like, why didn't you just go over to Mavis and start demand they show you the underside of the limo to get a better inspection? And why don't you go down there and do all these things? Why didn't you seize the vehicle? And Chad Smith would get very defensive, saying, well, I'm a peace officer. I'm not a police officer. I don't have the authority to like order people to do things like that. We have always wondered why the DOT didn't just seize that vehicle, take the plates off right then. I mean, what's the point of allowing it to remain on the road, giving Nauman so many chances?
I feel like Chad Smith's testimony for me, and again, I wasn't in the courtroom, but I have, pored over the transcript and read it several times, that it just raised more questions than it answered.
The lack of oversight by the DOT seemed to be institutional.
Remember back in episode 3, when Larry and I spoke with former New York State DOT Inspector Ron Barton? He talked about noticing the lack of operating authority and the missing bus inspection stickers. At the time, he raised a third issue with the limo, and with Chad Smith.
These motor care investigators are paper auditors. They have no mechanical experience.
Barton claims that political clashing between public employee unions led to the DOT allowing lower-level, non-mechanic investigators like Chad Smith to do roadside inspections as part of the bus program, instead of the trained motor carrier inspectors like Barton.
The problem is he never checked the brakes on this vehicle through 2 inspections because he couldn't get underneath it. Okay, our bus program is specific. You have to have a pit or a lift so that the inspector can get underneath them.
Ron basically points out, the inspection he did isn't even to spec. He should have been under that vehicle, should have been testing more of the components than he did. It was basically like not a great inspection, even though he was able to order the limousine off the road. But in the end of the day, Chad Smith didn't know how bad the brakes were on that limo. And when they realized they had a problem with this, they should have turned it over to another DOT department.
Again, via email, the New York State DOT declined to participate in this podcast or to answer any of our questions about the limo crash case. It was 8 days into the trial by the time Chad Smith was excused from the stand. Juror Andrea Austin says she had not made up her mind about the case at that point in the trial. There was still plenty of witness testimony to be heard, but thus far, she felt like the prosecution wasn't doing its best.
It kind of felt like this was a little over, especially over Ms. Mallory's head at points. I understand it's a very high profile case. It's probably something that this county won't see again in decades, if ever. But sometimes it just felt like they gave up on questioning in some aspects a little bit too soon.
Larry was reporting daily from Schoharie. He'd spend all day in court frantically taking notes so that he wouldn't misremember a word of the trial. And then he spent all night thinking about what had gone down in court that day. And he says he was getting a similar vibe about the prosecution.
I mean, at that point, Susan seemed so disorganized, and I didn't feel like she had made her case well enough, and Lee seemed to be doing really well at attacking her witnesses. So at that point, I thought that Lee Kinlan and Nauman would win.
Next time on Catastrophic Failure, revelations come out about what happened to the limo when Nauman Hussain brought it in for service to Mavis Discount Tire.
He ordered one of his employees to just slap an inspection sticker, passing DMV inspection sticker, on the limo.
I actually told him to burn it.
Okay, I have received a note from you that marked as court exhibit number 7, and it reads, "We have a verdict."
Nauman Hussain's fate is decided.
I just was feeling almost like overwhelmed, like how do I even report this? My emotions are going to take over here.
I never had any real doubts or any real regrets about how the verdict ended up coming out.
Catastrophic Failure is a production of the Times-Union. It's produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall. Original reporting by Larry Rulison. Editorial direction and fact-checking by Erica Smith and Casey Seiler. Our theme music is Undercurrent by Harper Ray. If you have any questions or comments about anything in this podcast, or you're a player in the story who wants to talk to us for it, please email us at podcast@timesunion.com. That's podcast@timesunion.com.